Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission is always the same. We take that stack of sources you send us, the articles, the history, the forgotten research, and we pull out the insights you really need.
And today, we're zooming in on just one single year, 1921.
When you think of 1921, you probably picture it as a kind of bridge, right? The quiet moment between World War I and the Roaring '20s.
But the sources, they paint a completely different picture. It was less of a bridge and more of a high-tension wire, just full of these profound, really agonizing contradictions.
Yeah, and that contradiction is exactly what we're diving into. The country was demanding what they called a return to normalcy. Simplicity, isolationism.
But at the very same time, the year was just consumed by an economic crash, by radical political shifts, and, domestic violence so extreme it actually required military intervention.
Our mission, then, is to really unpack that. How could a government promise peace and simplicity while at the same time using armed force against its own citizens?
It's an incredible amount to pack into 1 year. A new president, a devastating depression, the largest armed labor uprising in U.S. history, and the Tulsa Race Massacre.
It's just an astonishing 12 months. Okay, let's unpack this. And we have to start with the man who made that promise of stability, Warren G. Harding.
Right.
So Harding takes office in March of 1921. He follows Woodrow Wilson, who was very intense, very intellectual. Harding's whole campaign slogan was that return to normalcy.
And it was a massive appeal. People were they were completely exhausted.
Exhausted by war, by idealism, by constant reform.
Exactly. And Harding was popular precisely because he wasn't a firebrand. The sources call him a plain man. He just fit this new 1920s idea of, living easy.
People just wanted to relax.
They wanted low taxes, less government meddling, and just stability.
And he got to work on the isolationist part right away. In July, he formally ends the state of war with Germany and Austria-Hungary.
He basically just legally closed the book on the Great War with a joint resolution.
But his brand of isolationism wasn't just about walking away from the world, was it?
No, not at all. It was more about managing future conflict, but on American terms. Look at the Washington Naval Conference he led that year.
That was the one about disarmament.
Right. It led to these major international treaties for naval disarmament. And this wasn't some minor diplomatic event. This was the U.S. telling the world's biggest powers, Britain, Japan, France, to limit their arms.
Specifically to ease tensions in the Pacific.
Exactly. It was a huge statement. The U.S. was going to avoid future wars by basically dictating the terms of global peace.
So if America is retreating from the world stage, you'd think the government would shrink at home. But that's not what happened.
And that's the core contradiction of this whole period. To get that stability at home, Harding's administration actually had to build a bigger, more sophisticated federal machine.
You're talking about the Budget and Accounting Act.
I am. It created the Bureau of the Budget, and that signals this permanent, structural shift in federal power.
So what's the big deal about a new bureau? Why does it matter so much?
Well, before this, federal spending was kind of a mess. It was all handled by different congressional committees and departments. It was completely decentralized.
And this act changed that.
It completely changed it. It put the executive branch, the president, in the driver's seat of the nation's entire fiscal policy for the very first time.
So even as he's promising this simple, return to the past,
he's literally building the bureaucratic structure that would let the federal government grow exponentially for the rest of the century.
a powerful start to a very contradictory year.
And that new Bureau of the Budget was put to the test immediately because the economy in 1921 was anything but stable.
This is the recession of 1920-1921. It's often called the Forgotten Depression.
And it really deserves that name. It was a vicious, sharp, deflationary crash. I mean, the raw data is just astonishing.
Give us the numbers.
Okay, so wholesale prices plummeted by 36.8%.
36% in 1 year.
In a single year. That drop is actually steeper than the worst single year of the Great Depression. Business profits just vanished. They fell by 75%.
And for everyday people, farmers, laborers, what did that mean?
It meant ruin. Almost overnight. For farmers, the huge European demand from the war just evaporated as their own agriculture recovered, so crop prices went into a free fall.
And in the cities.
Unemployment shot up. Estimates vary, but somewhere between, say, 8.7 and 11.7%. Factories were closing their doors. Wages were slashed. It was brutal.
So what caused it to be so severe? The sources point a finger at the Federal Reserve.
Absolutely. The Fed was trying to fight post-war inflation, which had been a real problem, so they raised interest rates sharply, all the way up to 7%.
7%.
Now, that might not sound catastrophic today, but in that fragile post-war economy, it acted like slamming on the brakes. It just choked off all credit and investment.
And the government couldn't just stand by. Herbert Hoover, the Commerce Secretary, organized a conference on unemployment.
He did. They set up some federal, local collaborations for relief. They knew they couldn't just do nothing.
But they couldn't stop the social fallout either. This economic pain just poured gasoline on all the labor conflicts that were already simmering.
Yes, because businesses used the recession as an opportunity to launch what they called the American Plan.
We should define that for people. What was the American plan?
It was basically a nationwide coordinated campaign by industry to break the power of unions, to enforce what they called open shops.
Meaning you didn't have to join a union to work there.
Right, and they used a lot of anti-union rhetoric, linking unions to socialism, to radicalism, anything to justify cutting wages and fighting organized labor.
And this atmosphere of conflict led to literal open warfare.
In the coal fields of West Virginia.
It's just astonishing. In a year where the promise is peace, the president has to deploy the U.S. military against American citizens. We're talking about the Battle of Blair Mountain.
This is the largest armed labor uprising in the history of the United States. Thousands of striking coal miners fighting against local authorities and private mine guards.
For better conditions, for union recognition.
And the fighting escalated so much that President Harding had to send in federal troops. And not just troops, he sent bombers from the Army Air Service to restore order.
So that's the normalcy. It wasn't natural, it was imposed, sometimes violently, by the federal government.
It was militarized. And that really brings up a terrifying question. If the federal government is willing to use air power against organized labor, what happens to marginalized communities when local authorities turn against them?
And that question leads us directly to the Tulsa Race Massacre. It happened just a few months earlier, May 31st and June 1st, 1921.
This event is it's a catastrophic example of the violent reality that was bubbling right under that surface of normalcy.
Now, Tulsa, Oklahoma was an oil boom city, but it was also incredibly segregated. And the Greenwood District was known around the world as Black Wall Street.
It was unbelievably prosperous. Black-owned businesses, banks, professionals. And that success was, clearly a point of real tension and resentment for the surrounding white community.
A real powder keg.
A total powder keg. And the spark was this tiny incident. A young black shoe shiner named Dick Rowland and a white elevator operator, Sarah Page.
An encounter in a building, and then rumors started to fly.
Exactly. Fueled by sensationalist local newspapers, rumors spread that Rowland had assaulted Page. And soon there were calls for a lynching.
A group of black men, many of them armed World War I veterans, went down to the courthouse to make sure Rowland wouldn't be lynched.
And they were met by a huge armed white mob. A shot was fired, and according to the official report later, all hell broke loose.
But the attack that followed, this wasn't just spontaneous mob violence.
No, not at all. The sources are very clear. This was systematic destruction, and what's so horrifying is that it had active government complicity.
City officials were involved.
Mobs of white residents were, quote, deputized and armed by city government officials. That changes everything. It's no longer a riot. It's a sanctioned, military-style campaign against civilians.
The eyewitness accounts are just. They're unforgettable. People describe planes flying over Greenwood.
Not just watching, they were reportedly dropping burning turpentine balls. Men were firing rifles from the air into the neighborhood.
And on the ground, when fire crews tried to put out the fires, they were turned away at gunpoint by the mob.
The sheer scale of it is almost impossible to comprehend. The death toll estimates range from 75 to as high as 300. Over 35 square blocks of the most successful black neighborhood in America were burned to the ground.
Leaving 10,000 people homeless.
10,000 people. In a day.
And the justice that followed was a complete and utter travesty.
An all-white grand jury blamed the whole thing on black mobs for inciting a riot. Not a single white attacker was convicted for any of the deaths or the destruction of property.
The police chief was found guilty of negligence. That was it.
Negligence and some unrelated fraud charges, and then the silence. For decades, the event was just erased from history books.
It's only in recent years, because of survivor advocacy, that the narrative has finally started to shift. We now call it a massacre, not a riot.
And you have to remember, The human cost.
Yeah.
One of the last known living survivors, Leslie Benningfield Randall, who was just a child then, is now 111 years old. And she is still fighting for justice. The past is never past.
And this kind of systemic violence in Tulsa and at Blair Mountain, it wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was directly connected to this broader political atmosphere of nativism and fear.
Oh, absolutely. The Red Scare anxieties were still very fresh, and there was this political need to define who exactly belonged in this new normal America.
And that desire to restrict who counted as an American got written into law almost immediately. The Emergency Quota Act of May 1921.
This was a revolutionary piece of legislation. It set the first ever numerical limits on immigration based on national origins.
And the intent was pretty clear.
Crystal clear. It was designed to drastically cut back immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, places that many powerful Americans considered undesirable.
And this wasn't just about jobs or economics. It was rooted in the pseudoscience of the time.
Exactly. It was fueled by eugenics, this false racist idea that certain non-Nordic groups were biologically and culturally inferior, less fit to be American.
And at the same time, you have the trial of Sacco and Vanzetti.
Two Italian anarchists convicted of murder, and their case became this global symbol of judicial bias. The conviction was seen as being based more on their radical politics and their ethnicity than on the actual evidence.
So the laws are restricting who can come in, and groups like the Ku Klux Klan are terrorizing people who are already here.
And the Klan saw a massive resurgence in 1921. It expanded all through the Midwest with these anti-Black, anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant campaigns. It was an organized nationwide movement of exclusion.
But here's where it gets so contradictory again. While the government is passing these incredibly restrictive laws,
it's also taking some surprisingly progressive steps in domestic welfare.
we're talking about the Shepherd-Towner Act.
Yes, a landmark piece of legislation. It provided federal money for states to use on maternity and childcare programs.
So a major push for public health.
A huge push. It's the federal government acknowledging its role in protecting mothers and children. So in the same year, you get new forms of restriction and exclusion with the Quota Act and new forms of welfare and protection with Shepherd-Towner.
It just shows how conflicted the definition of who counted as American and who was worth protecting really was.
While all this is going on, American culture is just exploding. It's the real rise of mass culture, of national celebrity.
Technology was the engine. 1921 is the year KDKA in Pittsburgh broadcast the first ever baseball game on the radio.
And you have to think about what that means. Before this, culture was mostly local. Suddenly, this new medium is creating a shared national experience. You could be in Kansas or New York City and be listening to the same thing at the same time.
And the stars it created were larger than life. Babe Ruth was shattering home run records, a true national icon.
But celebrity had its dark side, too, the Fatty Arbuckle scandal.
A huge Hollywood star accused of rape and manslaughter. It absolutely rocked the country.
It did, and it fueled this massive moral panic. It became this proxy battle for cultural conservatives who were terrified that Hollywood was destroying American morality.
The perfect storm for 1921.
Yeah.
Extreme shock, followed by a demand for moral control.
And you can't talk about 1921 without mentioning the first Miss America pageant.
Right, in Atlantic City. The winner, a 16-year-old named Margaret Gorman, was hailed as the ideal of American womanhood.
A perfect traditional counterpoint to the growing freedom of the new flapper era.
And all of this is happening while Prohibition is in full swing.
And got even stronger in 1921 with the Willis-Campbell Act, which closed loopholes that let doctors prescribe beer and wine. It was the government doubling down, saying, no, we're serious about enforcing this moral policy.
So what does this all mean for you? 1921 wasn't some quiet prelude to the Roaring '20s. It was the violent, contradictory foundation the whole decade was built on.
Exactly. That political promise of normalcy, of a simple, ordered past, it could only be delivered through really aggressive federal action, economic restructuring, new laws, and sometimes just the physical suppression of dissent.
And that foundation was deeply fractured. You have the bright, glitzy lights of this new mass culture, the radio, the sports, the celebrities.
And it's all just a shiny veneer over this deep structural instability, the systemic racism in Tulsa, the massive economic volatility, and the government's willingness to turn its military inward at places like Blair Mountain.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you to consider. When the government of 1921 promised stability, it didn't really mean peace. It meant order.
And it was willing to use force to get that order.
So how did that heavy-handed use of force against American citizens, deploying federal troops to break a strike, city officials arming mobs in a race massacre, How did that establish a precedent for how the political establishment would handle internal conflicts for the rest of the decade?
The hands-off, isolationist policy they had for the rest of the world, well, it clearly did not apply to the conflicts that were erupting right here at home.